November 27th, 1856. Willowbrook Plantation, North Carolina. The scream cuts through the morning frost like a blade through butter. 10 white men lie scattered across the tobacco fields, their blood steaming in the cold November air. Farm tools, a hoe, a scythe, an axe, abandoned beside bodies that will never rise again. Elijah. That was the name of the slave who, on this Thanksgiving morning, turned the tools of his bondage into instruments of justice. The same hands that had picked cotton for 23 years, the same back that had bent under the whip's kiss, the same heart that had swallowed rage like bitter medicine, all of it unleashed in one perfect, terrible morning. The air smells of wood smoke from the big house kitchen, where the master's wife prepares her feast. She doesn't know yet. None of them know. The overseers who rode out at dawn to check the fields, to crack their whips and bark their orders, to remind every soul on Willowbrook Plantation who owned the earth beneath their feet, they will not be coming home for dinner. Elijah stands 6 feet tall, his skin the color of rich Carolina soil, hands scarred from decades of tobacco leaves and cotton bolts. At 41 years old, he has the quiet strength of a man who has learned to survive by making himself invisible. They trained him to bow his head, to say yes sir and no sir, to move through their world like a shadow cast by their convenience. But shadows can grow teeth. They called him reliable, steady, trustworthy. They were wrong about the last part. Trust implies choice, and Elijah never had that luxury. What they mistook for loyalty was simply the patience of a man counting every slight, cataloguing every cruelty, waiting for the perfect moment to balance the scales. The names burn in his memory like brands. Overseer Watson, who took Elijah's daughter Sarah to the big house and sent back only her torn dress. Overseer Mills, who beat Elijah's brother Jacob to death for allegedly stealing corn they found growing wild behind the slave quarters. Overseer Kane, who made sport of whipping the children, counting lashes like games. 10 overseers, 10 deaths, one for every year Sarah had been gone. This is the true story of Elijah, the slave who turned Thanksgiving into Judgment Day, who proved that even the most broken spirit can resurrect itself with fury and purpose. Before we continue with this story of blood and rebellion, drop a comment telling us where you're from and what time it is over there. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel, because stories like Elijah's deserve to be remembered, no matter how dark they get. The morning starts like every morning on Willowbrook Plantation. The bell clangs at 4:30, metal against metal, calling the slaves from their wooden shacks to another day of service. Elijah rises from his straw mattress, joints creaking like old floorboards. The November cold bites through the gaps in the cabin walls, and his breath forms small clouds in the darkness. He's been awake for hours anyway. Sleep comes hard when your dreams are populated by ghosts. Sarah's voice echoes in the pre-dawn silence, singing the lullaby he used to hum while braiding her hair. She would be 28 now, if she had lived to see 28. If Overseer Watson hadn't dragged her away that October night 3 years ago, her screams swallowed by the wind and his laughter. Elijah pulls on his work clothes, the same patched pants, the same cotton shirt, worn thin as paper. His reflection in the water basin shows a man carved hollow by loss, eyes that have seen too much, mouth that has forgotten how to smile. The other slaves call him Ghost Man, because he moves through the plantation silent as death itself. He steps outside into the gray morning, frost crunching under his bare feet. The tobacco fields stretch endless in every direction, brown stalks rattling like bones in the wind. Somewhere in those fields, his brother Jacob's blood still stains the earth. Somewhere in the big house, Sarah's memory haunts empty rooms. The overseers arrive on horseback as the sun climbs reluctantly above the tree line. 10 men on 10 horses, leather whips coiled at their sides like sleeping snakes. They ride in formation, a cavalry of cruelty, their breath and their horses' breath forming small storms in the cold air. Overseer Watson leads them, his face red with drink and authority. He's a thick man with thick hands and thick thoughts, the kind who believes ownership extends beyond property into souls. His horse prances beneath him, sensing the violence that always travels in his wake. "Morning, boys," Watson calls to his fellow overseers, his voice cutting through the morning quiet like a saw through wood. Thanksgiving Day. Time to remind these field hands what they got to be grateful for. The laughter that follows sounds like dogs barking. Elijah watches from beside the tool shed, his hands steady as he sorts through the morning's implements. Hoes for weeding, scythes for cutting, axes for chopping wood. Simple tools for simple tasks. He runs his thumb along the axe blade, testing its sharpness, feeling the weight of its wooden handle. The axe wasn't designed for killing white men, but then again, Elijah wasn't designed for slavery. Overseer Mills dismounts near the slave quarters, his boots leaving deep prints in the frost-covered dirt. He's younger than Watson, meaner too, with pale eyes that never blink and a smile that promises pain. He carries a wooden club carved with notches, one for every slave he's beaten unconscious. "Elijah!" Mills calls, pointing with his club. "Get your black ass over here. Fields need checking before the feast." Elijah doesn't respond immediately. He continues sorting tools, his movements deliberate and calm. This pause, this tiny rebellion of seconds, makes Mills' face darken like a storm cloud. "You deaf boy? I said move!" Still, Elijah takes his time, hefting the scythe, examining its curved blade in the morning light. The other slaves keep their heads down, pretending to work while watching from the corners of their eyes. They know that look on Elijah's face. They've seen it building for months, like pressure in a kettle. Finally, Elijah straightens and walks toward Mills, the scythe held loose in his right hand. His footsteps make no sound on the frozen ground. As he approaches, Mills raises his club, ready to deliver the usual lesson about prompt obedience. He never sees the blade coming. The scythe moves like liquid silver, catching Mills just below the ribs, opening him up like a ripe fruit. His eyes widen in shock, not pain yet, just surprise that the world has suddenly shifted on its axis. Blood pours from the wound, steaming in the cold air, and Mills stumbles backward, looking down at his opened belly with the confusion of a child who has broken something precious. Elijah doesn't stop to watch him fall. The element of surprise won't last long, and there are 9 more names on his list. 23 years ago, Elijah arrived at Willowbrook Plantation in chains, sold away from his mother at age 18. He remembers the taste of iron in his mouth, the weight of shackles around his ankles, the way his mother's sobs followed the slave wagon down the dusty Carolina road until distance swallowed them whole. Master Willowbrook bought him for his size and strength, put him to work in the tobacco fields where the sun beat down like a punishment and the leaves cut your hands to ribbons. Elijah learned quickly that survival meant invisibility, that the safest slave was the one nobody noticed. For 5 years he bent his back and held his tongue. For 5 years he watched men die, and women disappear, and children grow old before their time. For 5 years he told himself that patience was a virtue, that endurance was a form of resistance. Then he met Mary. She worked in the master's kitchen, a woman with gentle hands and a voice like honey over biscuits. She had been born on the plantation, knew every secret passage and hidden corner, every overseer's weakness and every master's fear. When she smiled at Elijah across the evening cookfire, he felt something inside him come back to life. They married the plantation way, jumping over a broomstick while the other slaves clapped and sang. No preacher or legal papers, just love, witnessed by those who understood what it meant to steal moments of joy from a world designed to crush them. Sarah came the following spring, born during a thunderstorm that shook the slave quarters like an earthquake. She emerged into the world crying, fists already clenched, ready to fight. Elijah held her against his chest and whispered promises he wasn't sure he could keep, that she would know freedom, that she would never bow her head to any man, that her father would move heaven and earth to protect her. Mary died when Sarah turned 12, her body worn out by too much work and too little food. The fever took her on a summer night, and Elijah sat beside her bed, holding her hand while she burned up from the inside. Her last words were about Sarah. Make sure she learns to read. Make sure she remembers her mother's songs. Make sure she knows she's worth more than their price. After Mary's death, Sarah became Elijah's entire world. He taught her letters by scratching them in the dirt behind the quarters. He told her stories about places beyond the plantation, about cities where black folks walked free and nobody owned anybody else. He saved scraps of his food to make sure she never went hungry. She grew up beautiful and strong and smart. Too smart for her own safety. By 15, she could read better than most white folks, could cipher numbers and ask questions that made the overseers nervous. She had her mother's gentle hands and her father's steel spine, a combination that made her magnetic and dangerous in equal measure. That's when Overseer Watson started watching her. October 15th, 1853. The date burns in Elijah's memory like a brand. Sarah had been helping in the big house that day, serving at the master's table, when Watson cornered her in the pantry. She fought him. Elijah knew this because Watson bore scratches on his face for weeks afterward. But one 18-year-old girl against a grown man with authority and meanness on his side never stood a chance. They found her body the next morning floating face down in the creek, her dress torn, her neck bearing purple fingerprints like a necklace of bruises. Watson claimed she had slipped and fallen, hit her head on the rocks. The master accepted this explanation without question because dead slaves were cheaper to explain than murdered ones. Elijah didn't cry at Sarah's funeral. He just stood beside the shallow grave while the preacher man mumbled words about Jesus and salvation. His hands clenched so tight, his nails drew blood from his palms. The other slaves watched him with careful eyes, recognizing the look of a man who had just lost his last reason to stay human. That night, he began planning. 3 years of planning. 3 years of watching and learning and waiting. 3 years of cataloging every overseer's routine, every weakness, every moment of vulnerability. 3 years of sharpening tools in secret, of practicing movements in the darkness, of turning his grief into something harder and sharper than any blade. Jacob died 2 months after Sarah, beaten to death by Overseer Mills for allegedly stealing corn that grew wild behind the slave quarters. Elijah held his brother's broken body while he gasped out his final words. Don't let them forget us. Don't let them forget us. Now, as Mills bleeds out in the frozen dirt and the other overseers shout in alarm, Elijah knows that memory has teeth. The chaos spreads like fire through dry grass. Mills's screams bring the other overseers running, their horses dancing nervously as the smell of blood fills the morning air. Elijah moves through them like a shadow made flesh, the scythe singing its deadly song. Overseer Cain goes next, caught off his horse by the curved blade as he tries to wheel around and flee. The scythe takes his head clean off, sending it rolling across the tobacco rows like a kicked ball, while his body topples sideways, fountaining blood across the frost-covered plants. "Jesus Christ!" Watson roars, fumbling for his pistol. "The nigger's gone mad! Shoot him! Shoot him now!" But panic makes poor marksman, and the remaining overseer's shots go wide, kicking up dirt and splintering fence posts while Elijah dances between them, untouchable as smoke. He drops the scythe and scoops up Mill's abandoned club, feeling its weight, reading the story of violence carved into its surface. Overseer Peters tries to run, spurring his horse toward the tree line, but Elijah's arm moves like a catapult, sending the club spinning through the air. It catches Peters in the spine with a crack like breaking timber, pitching him forward over his horse's neck to land in a heap among the brown tobacco stalks. 7 left. Elijah retrieves the axe from beside the tool shed, its handle worn smooth by decades of honest work. Today, it will do different work, but no less honest. He advances on the remaining overseers with the patience of a man who has waited 3 years for this moment, who knows that hurry is the enemy of thoroughness. Overseer Davis raises his whip, cracking it toward Elijah's face, but the leather finds only empty air. Elijah steps inside the whip's reach and brings the axe up in a devastating arc that opens Davis from groin to throat, spilling his intestines across the frozen ground like party streamers. The morning air fills with the sounds of dying men, screams and moans, and the wet gurgling of blood in throats. The horses rear and buck, their riders fighting to control them while Elijah moves among them like an avenging angel, dealing death with surgical precision. He doesn't hurry. Each strike is deliberate, calculated, personal. For Sarah, the axe blade splits Overseer Thompson's skull like a melon. For Jacob, the hoe crushes Overseer Wilson's ribs into powder. For Mary, the scythe opens Overseer Hayes's neck like a second mouth, releasing a torrent of red that steams in the cold air. The slave quarters have gone silent, 200 pairs of eyes watching their ghost man become something more terrible and beautiful than any of them had imagined. Some of the children hide behind their mothers' skirts, but others stand transfixed by the sight of their oppressors, receiving the justice they've dreamed about in whispered conversations. Overseer Watson, the last one mounted, finally gets his pistol clear and fires. The ball catches Elijah in the shoulder, spinning him around, but he doesn't go down. Instead, he looks up at Watson with eyes that hold no pain, no fear, only a terrible patience. "You remember my Sarah?" Elijah asks, his voice carrying clearly across the field despite the chaos. It's the first words he's spoken all morning, and they land like stones in still water. Watson's face goes pale as he fumbles to reload. "The girl was an accident. She fell, damn you. She fell." Elijah picks up the scythe again, its blade now painted red. "She didn't fall, Watson. You pushed her, after you finished with her." The truth hangs between them like a blade itself, cutting through Watson's lies and excuses. Around them, the other overseers lie scattered like broken dolls, their blood turning the frost-covered ground into a canvas of red and brown. "You're a dead man!" Watson screams, still fighting with his powder and shot. "Dead! They'll hang you slow for this. They'll burn you alive." Elijah nods calmly. "Maybe so, but you won't see it." He moves with liquid grace, closing the distance between them in heartbeats. Watson's horse rears as Elijah grabs the bridle and the overseer tumbles backward, landing hard on the frozen ground. Before he can rise, the scythe blade finds his throat, opening it like a door to let his life pour out. Watson tries to speak, but only blood comes out. His eyes hold shock and outrage and something else. The dawning realization that the natural order he'd believed in, the hierarchy that placed him above other men by virtue of skin color alone, had been nothing but smoke and mirrors all along. Elijah kneels beside Watson as the overseer's life ebbs away, speaking softly, intimately, like a confessor receiving last words. "Sarah was going to be a teacher," he says. "She could read Shakespeare, did you know that? Hamlet, Macbeth, all of them. She was going to teach other children, help them find their way to freedom through learning." Watson's mouth opens and closes like a fish out of water, no sound emerging except the wet rattle of approaching death. "Jacob was going to be a preacher," Elijah continues. "He memorized whole chapters of the Bible, could recite them word for word. He was going to start his own church, marry folks proper, bury them with dignity." The light fades from Watson's eyes like a candle being snuffed, but Elijah keeps talking, offering his victims' stories as a kind of eulogy. "Mary was going to see the ocean. She dreamed about it every night, all that water stretching to the horizon, blue as freedom itself. She was going to walk on the sand and let the waves wash over her feet." By the time he finishes speaking, Watson is gone, his blood mixing with the blood of his fellow overseers to create a lake of red that reflects the grey November sky like a mirror. Elijah stands slowly, surveying his work. 10 men dead, 10 souls sent to whatever judgment, and awaits those who profit from human misery. The tobacco fields have never been so quiet, so still. Even the wind seems to hold its breath. From the big house comes the sound of the dinner bell, calling the master's family to their Thanksgiving feast. They don't know yet that their overseers won't be joining them, that their careful system of control has just been shattered by one man with farm tools and a heart full of rage. The other slaves begin to emerge from their quarters, moving cautiously across the blood-soaked field. They look at Elijah with a mixture of awe and terror, recognizing that he has crossed a line from which there is no return. Old Martha, the plantation's eldest slave, approaches first. She's been at Willowbrook longer than anyone, has seen masters and overseers come and go like seasons. Her ancient hands shake as she reaches out to touch Elijah's face. "Lord, have mercy," she whispers. "What have you done, child?" Elijah looks down at his hands, still gripping the scythe handle. His clothes are soaked with blood, some his own from Watson's pistol ball, most belonging to dead white men. He feels empty now, hollow, like a vessel that has finally poured out its contents. "What I should have done 3 years ago," he says quietly. The sound of hoofbeats carries across the morning air. riders approaching from the main road. Word has spread somehow, as word always does in the Carolina countryside. The masters are coming, bringing dogs and rope and the full weight of a system that cannot allow such rebellion to go unpunished. Elijah doesn't run. He stands among the bodies of his enemies, the bloodied tools at his feet, waiting for whatever comes next. The other slaves begin to scatter, unwilling to be caught near the scene of such violence. But a few remain, the brave ones, the stubborn ones, those who understand that some moments are worth witnessing, regardless of the consequences. Young Thomas, barely 16, steps forward with tears streaming down his face. "Mr. Elijah, you got to run. They'll kill you for sure." Elijah shakes his head. "I'm tired of running, boy. Been running all my life, from masters, from overseers, from the truth of what they've done to us. No more running." The riders appear at the edge of the tobacco field. A dozen white men armed with rifles and righteous anger. At their head rides Master Willowbrook himself, his face purple with rage, his expensive clothes already dusty from hard riding. "There he is!" Willowbrook screams, pointing at Elijah with a trembling finger. "The murdering savage! Shoot him down like the animal he is!" But something stops them. Maybe the sight of so much blood. Maybe the calm way Elijah stands among the carnage. Maybe the understanding that they are witnessing something larger than simple rebellion. Whatever it is, they hesitate, forming a circle around the killing ground, but not yet closing in. Master Willowbrook dismounts slowly, his legs shaking with age and fury. He's owned men for 40 years, bought and sold human beings like livestock, built his fortune on broken backs and stolen lives. Now, for the first time, he faces the consequences of that investment. "You killed my overseers," he says, his voice barely controlled. "Murdered them in cold blood." Elijah meets his gaze steadily. "Yes, sir, I did." "Why?" The question comes out strangled, desperate. "They were good men, Christian men. What could possibly justify—" "Sarah." Elijah's voice cuts across Willowbrook's protests like a blade. "Jacob, Mary, Rebecca, Samuel, Moses. Should I go on?" The names hang in the morning air like accusations. Each one represents a slave who died under Willowbrook's ownership, a life snuffed out by overwork or violence or simple neglect. Elijah has kept count, remembered them all, carried their memory like stones in his heart. Willowbrook's face grows even redder. Those were unfortunate incidents, accidents, the natural result of owning people like they was property. Elijah takes a step forward and several of the armed men raise their rifles, of treating human beings like they was horses or cattle. "They are property!" Willowbrook screams. "You are property! I bought you fair and square, and I have every right!" The words die in his throat as Elijah laughs, a sound like breaking glass, like winter wind through empty trees. It's the first time he's laughed in 3 years, and the sound chills everyone who hears it. "Rights," Elijah repeats, tasting the word like something bitter. "You think God gave you rights to own my body? To sell my daughter? To work my wife to death in your kitchen?" He spreads his arms wide, embracing the scene of carnage around him. Blood drips from his fingertips, painting small circles in the dirt. "Well, Master Willowbrook, seems like God gave me some rights too. Right to remember, right to grieve, right to balance the scales." The plantation owner backs away, suddenly understanding that no amount of money or law or social position can protect him from the justice Elijah represents. This is bigger than rebellion, bigger than insurrection. This is reckoning itself, payment coming due for debts too long ignored. "Shoot him!" Willowbrook shrieks to his men. "Shoot him now before he—" But Elijah is already moving, diving toward the nearest rifle even as the men pull their triggers. Bullets whine through the air where he was standing, and then he's among them, the bloodied scythe singing its death song one final time. The battle is brief and vicious. Elijah fights like a man with nothing to lose, which is exactly what he is. 2 more men fall before a rifle butt catches him behind the ear, dropping him to his knees in the bloody dirt. They swarm him then, a dozen white men with fists and boots and 3 years of stored-up fear. They beat him until his ribs crack, until his face swells beyond recognition, until the only thing keeping him conscious is the memory of Sarah's voice singing lullabies in the darkness. When they finally stop, Elijah lies broken and bleeding beside the bodies of the overseers he killed. His left eye is swollen shut, his right arm bent at an impossible angle, blood pooling beneath his shattered skull. But he's still breathing, still alive. Master Willowbrook approaches cautiously, as if Elijah might spring up and attack even in his ruined condition. "String him up," he orders. "Right here, right now. Let every slave on this plantation see what happens to murderers and insurrectionists." They bring rope from the tool shed, the same rope Elijah used to bind tobacco leaves, now twisted into a noose for his neck. As they fashion the loop, he thinks about Sarah, about the way she used to braid flowers into her hair. He thinks about Jacob, about his gentle hands and his dreams of preaching salvation. He thinks about Mary, about ocean waves she'll never feel washing over her feet. They're waiting for him now, all of them, on the other side of whatever comes after dying, waiting to hear about this morning, about how their deaths were finally answered with justice. The rope goes around his neck like an embrace. They drag him to the big oak tree beside the slave quarters, the same tree where generations of Willowbrook slaves have gathered for rare moments of celebration. Now it will serve a different purpose. As they hoist him up, his feet kicking at empty air, Elijah manages one final act of defiance. With his last breath, he speaks loud enough for every slave on the plantation to hear. "Remember us," he gasps. "Remember our names." The words echo across the tobacco fields like a command, like a promise, like a prayer. And in the slave quarters, in the hidden places where stories are kept alive by whispered telling and retelling, they do remember. They remember Elijah, the ghost man who became an angel of vengeance. They remember Sarah and Jacob and Mary and all the others whose names he carried like weapons into battle. They remember the morning when 10 overseers died and the natural order revealed itself to be nothing more than violence dressed up in law and custom. The story spreads like wildfire through the plantation system, carried by traveling slaves and sympathetic whites, growing larger with each telling. In some versions, Elijah kills 20 overseers. In others, he leads a full uprising that burns 3 plantations to the ground. The truth becomes less important than the message. Resistance is possible, justice can be seized by bloody hands, and even the most powerless among us can become instruments of divine wrath. Master Willowbrook hangs Elijah's body from the oak tree for 3 days, warning other slaves about the price of rebellion. But the warning backfires. Instead of fear, Elijah's sacrifice inspires courage. Slaves throughout North Carolina begin to remember their own grievances, their own lost children and murdered kin. Some run away to join the Underground Railroad. Others organize quiet resistance, sabotaging crops and machinery. A few follow Elijah's example more directly, turning tools into weapons and settling their own accounts with blood. The authorities eventually cut down Elijah's body and bury it in unmarked ground, hoping to erase all trace of his rebellion. But you cannot bury memory, cannot kill a story that has already taken root in human hearts. Somewhere in the Carolina soil, his bones rest beside those of his fellow slaves, and somewhere in the collective memory of the oppressed, his spirit continues to speak. November 27, 1856. 10 overseers dead, 1 slave hanged, and a system of human bondage revealed for the house of cards it always was. Elijah's rebellion lasted only 1 morning, but its echoes would reverberate through the remaining years of slavery and BO, and reminding anyone who would listen that justice delayed is not justice denied, merely justice waiting for the right hands to deliver it. In the years following the Civil War, when former slaves began to tell their stories openly, Elijah's name would surface again and again. Old Martha, the plantation elder who witnessed his final mourning, lived to see emancipation and spent her remaining years sharing his story with anyone who would listen. She would tell them about the ghost man who refused to stay dead, about the father who loved his daughter enough to damn his own soul for vengeance, about the morning when the meek inherited the earth through violence and righteousness. Today, more than a century and a half later, Elijah's story endures as a reminder that evil, no matter how deeply entrenched, no matter how protected by law and custom, will eventually meet its match in human determination. His name joins the pantheon of those who chose to die standing rather than live kneeling. who understood that some prices are worth paying and some battles are worth fighting, even when victory seems impossible. The Willowbrook plantation is long gone now, its big house demolished, its tobacco fields returned to forest. But somewhere in the North Carolina soil, beneath the roots of oak trees and the accumulated leaves of countless autumns, the blood Elijah spilled on that Thanksgiving morning still cries out for remembrance. If this story haunts your dreams, it's because some ghosts are meant to be restless. Some memories are meant to burn like brands in the conscience of a nation built on stolen labor and murdered innocence. And some men, even in death, refuse to be forgotten. Subscribe and share this story with those who understand that history's greatest heroes are often those who never expected to become heroes at all. Ordinary people pushed beyond their limits, who discovered that extraordinary courage was hiding in their hearts all along, waiting for the right moment to emerge bathed in blood and righteousness. Remember their names. Remember Elijah.